So thank you so much for inviting me to this event, which I've looked forward to, not only because Manchester Lit and Phil has such a distinguished history, but also because I get to spend time with Paul Cartledge, who has been incredibly generous throughout my work with free speech. I remember I had a podcast on the history of free speech that went before the book, and out of nowhere, I decided to email Paul and ask him, whether he uh, would have the time to listen through a recording, an early recording, and he generously agreed. He came up with detailed criticism and constructive suggestions for improvements, and he even agreed to be on an expert episode. And I thought, here's the eminent expert on the history of democracy and ancient Greece, and this person out of nowhere with no credentials writes him, and he has a very busy agenda, and nonetheless he agrees, and I just thought that was incredibly generous, and we've been in touch ever since. You've also commented on the draft, though I take full responsibility for all shortcomings in the manuscript. But I thought that I would start out with a few comments on the book and how I see it relating to today, and then Paul and I can engage in more of a debate or Q&A on the topic. I think one of the main points of my book is to show that the origins of free speech stretch much further back than say the Enlightenment, where many might want to place it, might think, oh, well, this is maybe if you're British, you'd say the Glorious Revolution. French people would say the French Declaration on the Rights of Man. Americans would say the First Amendment. But in truth, the roots of free speech are ancient, deep, and sprawling. And so if we go back to 431 BCE, we see the Athenian statesman Pericles extolling the democratic values of open debate and tolerance of social dissent in the Athenian democracy. And if you go to the 9th century CE, the irreverent freethinker Ibn al-Rawandi used the fertile intellectual climate of the Abbasid Caliphate to question prophecy and holy books. In 1582, you have the Dutchman De Coornhead, who insisted that it was tyrannical to forbid good books in order to squelch the truth. So there are lots of precedents, and they're not uniquely Western, that are essential to the history of free speech, and that we need to account for to get a fuller understanding of where this freedom comes from and what it means today. One of the sad things about free speech is that almost invariably the introduction of free speech sets in motion a process of entropy. So what you tend to see is that the leaders of any political system, no matter how enlightened, convince themselves that now free speech has gone too far. So as we might get back to, autocratic oligarchs who were disdainful of sharing power with the masses twice overthrew the ancient Athenian democracy and purged proponents of democracy and dissent along the way. Hardening laws against apostasy and blasphemy also curtailed the most daring free thinking in medieval Islam. And this Dutch freethinker De Coornhead was exiled, and his writings were banned on several occasions. And even the Enlightenment's achievement were rolled back in 19th century Europe. And I think, unfortunately, this phenomenon of free speech entropy is as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. And when looking closer, I think the justifications for limiting free speech in the 21st century have more in common with those used many centuries past than perhaps we'd like to admit. So, for instance, if we look at the global club of free democracies, it is actually shrinking at this moment. And as in ancient Athens, aspirational autocrats from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Modi in India view free speech as the first and most important obstacle to be cleared on path to entrenching their power. In parts of the Islamic world, blasphemy and apostasy is still punishable by death, whether enforced by the state or vigilantes. But even liberal democracies have been afflicted by what I would call a free speech recession, where governments are fearful of the consequences of disinformation, hostile propaganda, hate speech, spreading uncontrollably among the masses through new technology, and where academic and cultural institutions are internalizing the idea that the values of free speech and equal dignity are sometimes mutually exclusive rather than mutually reinforcing. And perhaps most importantly, free speech entropy is not merely political, but deeply rooted in human psychology. The drive to please others, the fear of outgroups, the desire to avoid conflict, and everyday norms of kindness just pull us in the direction of wanting to silence uncomfortable speakers, whether on digital platforms, college campuses, or in cultural institutions. So I think it's all the more vital to actively foster and maintain a culture of free speech to ensure that this freedom continues. So legislation is not enough on its own, and this, I think, is especially true in democracy. Because to impose silence and call it tolerance does not make it so. I believe that real tolerance requires understanding. Understanding comes from listening, and listening presupposes. Or to quote one of my favorites, George Orwell, if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. But if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. So that is sort of my very brief executive summary of the book and my view on free speech. And I hope that we can tease them out in conversation with Paul and, of course, with those of you who are attending today. So thank you for those introductory remarks.
Huge thanks, Jacob. And I'm going to follow up, first of all, by thanking on our joint behalf the organisers, the Manchester Lytton Phil, especially your president, Ian Cameron, Dundaji, a member of your council, and on the technical side, but for whom we wouldn't be here at all, I'd like to thank Liam and Ode and Rachel. And then last but by no means least, our chair, a volunteer, heroic, Mabin. Manchester is actually particularly relevant to our theme this evening. To give one historical example from the past, what's called the Peterloo Massacre occurred, of course, within your bailiwick, in your vicinity. And via Percy Bysshe Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy, it's a key part in the chain of information discussion of free speech from, in this case, early modernity to contemporary times. And of course, it features prominently in Jacob's book, pages 208 to 209. And then just to give you one other illustration, very familiar to you, but not necessarily to everybody outside Manchester, what's now called the Guardian news was originally the Manchester Guardian. And it was what I'd call a classically liberal newspaper. And that term's rather important because when we speak of today liberal democracy, as opposed to any other kind, there's one sense in which it distinguishes all versions of post-Enlightenment, modern contemporary democracies from the kinds of democracy that I, as an academic, a classicist, an ancient historian, specialize in. Namely, the ancient democracies were anything but liberal. I'm not saying that they were, by definition hostile to freedom. On the contrary, but they didn't have the notion of liberalism, which springs from the notion that one must be free as an individual from the demands, the control, sometimes the tyranny of a centralized state. In ancient Greece, which is a huge, diverse place, of course, 1,000 different cities, but we're going to focus just on Athens. There was no such notion of the state as against the citizens. The citizens were the state. They made the community the polity. And so in that sense, any notion of liberal democracy has to be thought of as modern as opposed to ancient. Now, as Jacob has said, we have collaborated I love him to bits, but I've never actually met him in person. And that's partly due to COVID, of course, but for other reasons as well. So it's a real pleasure to meet you again, Jacob, virtually, but I hope one day we will meet in person, face to face. The book through which we were mostly brought together, and the podcast, the book is very long, and partly that's because it covers a huge amount of ground. You've already heard East, as we say today, as well as West, from antiquity to modernity. It's over 500 pages, but you've already heard Jacob's prose. It's extremely eloquent, though it will actually be a pleasure to read 500 pages. But there was an ancient Greek, his name was Callimachus, and he said, a big book adds up to a big evil. And I think the reason he said that was that he was a librarian. And in those days, librarians had to deal with scrolls made of papyrus, extraordinarily bulky and extraordinarily painful. Now, of course, you can read Jacob's book online in minute format. So that's the modern world for you. And another of our themes is the differences in when we have instant electronic distanced communication, as opposed to in the ancient world where there were no remote means of instant communication. Yes, they could communicate at a distance, but it took a long time. That makes a difference to the quality of discourse.